It began with a trunk tucked away in a dusty attic, behind a stack of forgotten suitcases. David Parker wasn't looking for anything when he opened it. Inside, tied with aging twine, were hundreds of letters, some dated more than 60 years earlier. On the lid of the trunk, carved by hand, was a single number, 9. The envelopes were yellowed but intact. The ink faded to a soft brown. Each bore the same 2 names, Eleanor Parker and Richard Cole. What David didn't realize then was that he had stumbled upon a love story written not in novels, but in real letters, folded, sealed, and left to wait for someone to find them. Each page revealed a world suspended in time, summer days by a wooden bridge, midnight confessions written by lamplight, and a mailbox that became their secret meeting place. Through seasons of change, Eleanor and Richard built a bond through ink and paper, until one letter went missing, and silence changed everything. For decades, the letters remained untouched, their story hidden within a house that grew quiet over the years. But now, after so much time, their voices are rising again, through the crackle of old paper and the number carved deep into wood. This is the story of Mailbox 9, a story of love written across distance, of promises folded into envelopes, and of words that refused to disappear, even when time tried to bury them. In this video, we'll journey back to the late 1950s and early 1960s, when handwritten letters carried emotions that couldn't be spoken aloud. It's the story of Eleanor Parker and Richard Cole, 2 young souls whose lives intertwined through a simple mailbox at the edge of a quiet town. Over the years, their letters became more than messages. They became lifelines, carrying laughter, hope, silence, and everything in between. Through their words, we'll uncover how a single lost letter reshaped their connection, how distance tested their promises, and how time eventually tucked their story away in an attic, waiting to be rediscovered. This isn't a tale of grand gestures or public declarations. It's the story of quiet love, the kind that lingers between pages, that whispers through decades, and that leaves behind traces for others to find. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the Found Pages, like this video if you enjoy stories hidden in letters and diaries, and let us know in the comments which country and city you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how these forgotten stories travel across the world. The summer of 1959 arrived gently in Maplewood, a small American town where time seemed to move a little slower. Cicadas hummed in the afternoon heat. Porch swings creaked in rhythm with soft breezes, and neighbors greeted one another like members of an extended family. It was in this world, simple yet alive, that Eleanor Parker first met Richard Cole. Eleanor was 18, thoughtful and quiet. Most evenings, she could be found on the front porch of her family's house, a book resting on her lap, her feet brushing against the wooden boards as she swayed on the swing. Richard noticed her on his first day in town. He had come from the next city over to work for his uncle's construction business for the summer. A temporary stay, but one that would change both their lives. Their first conversation happened almost by accident. Richard had passed by her house on his bicycle, and Eleanor had laughed softly at the way his hat nearly flew off in the wind. He stopped, slightly embarrassed, and made a joke to cover it. She replied with a smile that lingered a little longer than expected. From that moment, their paths seemed to naturally cross again and again. Evening walks turned into shared conversations under the fading orange sky. They spoke about books, music, dreams, and the places they wanted to see one day. Richard, more impulsive and full of energy, admired Eleanor's quiet confidence. She, in turn, was drawn to his optimism, a kind of warmth she didn't know she'd been missing. By mid-July, their meetings were no longer by chance. Every evening, Richard would lean his bicycle against the fence and sit beside Eleanor on the porch swing. Neighbors would wave, pretending not to notice the way the two of them grew closer with each passing day. Maplewood was small, but summer made it feel like the world existed only for them. Their favorite place soon became Mailbox number 9, the weathered wooden mailbox that stood at the edge of the Parker family's yard. It was nothing special, just old paint peeling under the sun. But to them, it was their meeting point, their silent witness. They left small folded notes inside, hidden between newspapers and bills, a drawing, a line from a book, a simple thinking of you. As August approached, reality began to creep into their endless summer. Richard had accepted a full-time job with his uncle in the next town over. It wasn't far, but far enough that visits would become rare. On their last evening together, they sat beside the mailbox as the sun disappeared, both knowing what was coming but unwilling to say it out loud. "Promise me you'll write," Eleanor said, her voice soft, her hands folded in her lap. "Every week," Richard replied. "No letter will ever go unanswered." He squeezed her hand, as if sealing the words between them. The air was warm, but beneath their shared silence, there was a quiet ache neither wanted to name. A few days later, Eleanor stood on the porch, watching Richard's bicycle grow smaller until it vanished into the dusty road. The house felt strangely still without him. The first letter arrived the following Friday, neatly folded, addressed to her in his careful handwriting. She read it 3 times that night, holding it close as if it were a piece of him. The next morning, she placed her reply inside Mailbox 9 for the postman to collect, trusting that her words would find their way back to him. Summer ended, but their letters became the bridge between 2 towns. With each envelope that arrived, their bond deepened. Mailbox 9, once just a piece of wood, turned into the quiet, beating heart of their story, a place where promises were kept, week after week, sealed with ink and hope. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Each Friday, without fail, a letter from Richard arrived in Mailbox 9. Eleanor would wait until evening to open it, as if savoring the moment was part of the ritual itself. Under the warm glow of the porch light, she unfolded his words with careful hands, as though each page carried his presence across the miles. Richard's letters were a blend of humor, detail, and something slowly deepening between the lines. He wrote about his work at the construction site, the way the sun beat down on the gravel roads, the sound of trains in the distance at night. But he also wrote about her, about the sound of her laugh, the way the porch swing creaked when she shifted her weight, and how he missed it all more than he'd expected. Eleanor responded faithfully every Saturday morning. Her letters were gentle, full of observations about Maplewood. Mrs. Turner's roses blooming early, children chasing fireflies in the dusk, the smell of summer rain after long afternoons. But beneath her careful handwriting, there was a growing warmth, a quiet confession stretching across pages. Her letters became her voice, steady and real. Samuel Jenkins, the town's mail carrier, had worked the same route for 20 years. He noticed patterns for a living, who got bills, who got postcards, who waited for nothing at all. It didn't take long for him to spot Eleanor's habit. Every Saturday morning, a neatly stamped envelope addressed to Richard Cole was waiting inside Mailbox 9 without exception. At first, Samuel thought nothing of it. Young people fell in love every summer, and letters came and went like fireflies. But as August turned to September, he began to take quiet notice of the regularity. Richard's letters arriving precisely on Fridays, Eleanor's replies leaving Saturdays. The consistency gave their story a kind of invisible heartbeat, one Samuel found oddly comforting on his morning rounds. As the months passed, the tone of their letters changed. Richard's handwriting grew slightly bolder, his sentences longer, his words more tender. Eleanor began to seal her envelopes with small pressed flowers from her mother's garden, tucked between the pages like quiet secrets. What had started as summer companionship was deepening into something neither of them dared to name out loud. Samuel, without ever opening a letter, became an unspoken witness. He imagined the contents during his long walks. Perhaps Richard had proposed a visit, or maybe Eleanor had confessed a fear. Each envelope, though sealed, seemed to hum faintly with emotion as he slipped it into the bag slung over his shoulder. One Friday, the rhythm faltered. Samuel noticed the absence before Eleanor did. The usually reliable envelope from Richard was missing from his stack. He checked twice, then a third time, convinced he must have overlooked it. But it wasn't there. When Eleanor opened Mailbox 9 that evening and found it empty, her hands lingered inside the box longer than usual, as if searching for something that might still arrive. That night, rain began to fall, light at first, then steadily, tapping against the windows in a way that made the house feel larger and lonelier. Eleanor sat by the window, the unopened letters from previous weeks stacked neatly beside her. She told herself delays happened, roads flooded, mail could be late. But beneath those rational thoughts, a quiet unease took root. Samuel, too, felt the shift as he walked his route the next morning. Something about that missing letter unsettled him. He'd carried thousands of envelopes over the years, but this one, this single gap in their steady rhythm, felt like a silence too loud to ignore. And somewhere between the two towns, a letter remained unwritten, or undelivered. The missing letter lingered like a ghost between them. For the first few days, Eleanor convinced herself it was nothing. Roads flooded, trucks broke down, postmen misplaced stacks. These things happened. But as Friday turned into the next, and Mailbox 9 remained empty, the silence grew heavier than any explanation she could offer herself. What Eleanor didn't know was that, on the very night before the delay, Richard had sat alone at his uncle's kitchen table under the dim glow of a single bulb. He had written the longest letter of his life, 3 full pages, each line carrying a weight he'd been too shy to speak out loud. For the first time, his words went beyond casual stories or playful remarks. He told her how the distance had made him realize how deeply he cared for her. He wrote about his plans to return to Maplewood not just for visits, but for good. He'd sealed the envelope carefully, pressing his initials into the wax, a small gesture meant only for her eyes. Early the next morning, he'd handed it to the post office clerk with an almost nervous smile, unaware that somewhere between the two towns, the letter would vanish into the cracks of routine, misplaced, delayed, or perhaps lost forever. Eleanor began to write her next letter, but the words came slower. She stared at the blank page, tapping her pen against the wooden desk. How do you respond to silence? How do you keep warmth alive when nothing comes back to meet it? Her usual observations about Maplewood suddenly felt shallow. She folded the empty page and put it aside. By the following week, a letter finally arrived from Richard, but it was brief, almost hurried. He apologized for being busy at work, assured her he was fine, and promised a longer one soon. But for Eleanor, the damage was already done. The missing letter had changed the space between them. What had been effortless now felt uncertain, like a song that had skipped a beat. Samuel noticed before anyone else. Eleanor's Saturday envelopes, once decorated with pressed flowers and careful handwriting, now appeared plainer, written in a slightly firmer hand. When he delivered Richard's Friday letters, he saw her hesitate before opening them, holding the envelope not with eagerness, but with quiet caution. He'd seen heartbreak before. It had its own kind of stillness. Richard, meanwhile, sensed a shift in Eleanor's tone, but couldn't place its cause. Her letters were polite, warm even, but something was missing. The spark between sentences, the small, playful details that had made him smile. He reread them late at night, wondering if she'd grown tired of him or if distance was slowly wearing down what they had built. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm that had once been their heartbeat now faltered like an uneven clock. Neither of them mentioned the silence directly. Richard assumed she was pulling away. Eleanor believed he already had. And the lost letter, resting somewhere between them, remained silent witness to everything unraveling. One evening, Eleanor stood by Mailbox 9 as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road. She ran her fingers along the wooden edges, now worn smooth by countless letters passed through its slot. For the first time since summer, she considered the possibility that their story might not end the way she had imagined. Far away, Richard folded another letter, shorter this time, almost hesitant. He signed it with his usual flourish, but paused before sealing it. Something inside him whispered that words might no longer be enough. But he sent it anyway, unaware that the letter he'd poured his heart into weeks earlier had never reached her, and that its absence had quietly rewritten their story. Autumn arrived quietly in Maplewood, painting the trees in shades of gold and rust. The warm nights of summer had given way to crisp mornings and skies the color of faded postcards. Eleanor wrapped her scarf a little tighter as she walked past Mailbox 9, noticing how the once bright paint now blended into the muted season. The rhythm of their letters had slowed, and so had her hope. Richard had sensed the distance growing with each exchange, and the thought of losing what they'd built weighed on him more with every passing week. One chilly morning, without telling anyone, he packed a small bag, borrowed his uncle's truck, and drove back to Maplewood. He didn't have a plan. He just knew that some things couldn't be solved through ink alone. Eleanor was at the general store when she saw the familiar truck pull into town. For a brief second, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But when Richard stepped out, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, scanning the street like someone looking for a memory, her breath caught. Months of unspoken questions hung between them like cold air. They met on the wooden bridge near the town square, a place where neither had planned to go, but both somehow ended up. The sound of the river beneath them filled the silence. Richard finally broke it. "I had to see you," he said. "Letters weren't enough anymore." His voice carried a mix of determination and uncertainty. Eleanor searched his face, trying to align the man standing before her with the words she'd been reading for months. "Why did you stop writing like before?" she asked, her voice steady, but her hands clenched in her pockets. "It felt like you were slipping away." Richard shook his head, confused. "I never stopped. I wrote the longest letter I've ever written. I told you everything." His eyes flickered with frustration, not at her, but at something beyond their control. "I waited for your reply for weeks. When it didn't come, I thought maybe you didn't feel the same." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "I never got that letter." The words hung between them, heavy and real. And in that moment, Richard understood. It wasn't doubt that had crept between them. It was a lost letter, somewhere on the road between their two towns, rewriting their story without either of them knowing. Samuel happened to pass by the bridge on his route, his worn leather mailbag slung over his shoulder. He tipped his hat when he saw them, sensing, without needing to hear, that something important was unfolding. Though he didn't speak, his presence carried the weight of every envelope he'd delivered between them. He knew better than anyone how fragile words could be. They walked together after that, slowly, as if relearning the rhythm that had once been effortless. Richard told her what the letter had contained. Eleanor listened with quiet intensity. The wind rustled through the trees like pages turning. By the time they reached her porch, the air between them had shifted, not back to summer but to something deeper, steadier. That night, Eleanor sat at her desk once more. For the first time in weeks, the words came easily. She began a new letter, not to fill a silence, but to begin again. Outside, Mailbox 9 stood in the cool night, waiting like an old friend who knew their story was far from over. Winter crept into Maplewood slowly, softening the edges of the town with pale light and breathy fog. The fields were bare, the trees skeletal, and Mailbox 9 stood like a quiet witness at the end of the lane, its once bright number now faint beneath layers of frost. Eleanor had grown used to waiting, though the waiting had changed. It was no longer anxious, it was steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Richard's visits had become less frequent but more meaningful. Each time he returned, their conversation stretched longer into the night, as if both understood that words now held the weight of unspoken futures. He had taken a position in a city hours away, and though neither said it outright, the distance between their towns had started to mirror the distance between their lives. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the first snow began to fall, Richard knocked on her door. He wasn't carrying his usual stack of letters, just his hat in his hands and a look that Eleanor had never seen before, somewhere between hope and resignation. "Can we take a walk?" he asked softly. She nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter, and followed him out into the cold. They walked down the quiet road until they reached the wooden bridge by the river. The water below was slow and heavy, carrying the season's last leaves. Richard leaned against the railing, staring at the horizon as if searching for the right words there. "I got an offer," he finally said. "Overseas, a year, maybe more. It's a big opportunity." Eleanor felt the chill settle deeper into her chest. She knew this moment would come, but knowing didn't make it any easier. "When?" she asked. Her voice didn't waver, but her hands trembled inside her gloves. 2 weeks, he answered. "I didn't want to write it in a letter. I needed to see you." He turned to her then, and for a long time neither of them spoke. It wasn't silence that separated them. It was everything they wanted but couldn't fit neatly into promises. Finally, Richard pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket. "This isn't goodbye," he said, placing it gently into her hands. "But I can't ask you to wait. I hope you'll write. Even if it's just to tell me about the weather or the town or Mailbox 9, don't let it be silent." His voice cracked on the last word. Eleanor pressed the envelope to her chest as she had with so many of his letters before. "I'll write," she whispered. She wanted to say more, to ask him to stay, to confess everything that lived between the lines, but the words remained folded inside her, like a letter never sent. At the train station 2 weeks later, she stood on the platform as the whistle blew. Richard leaned out the window, scanning the crowd until he found her. He didn't wave. Neither did she. They simply held each other's gaze until the train carried him away, shrinking into the white winter fog like a line of ink disappearing from a page. That night, Eleanor sat at her desk with a blank sheet of paper. Outside, snow gathered silently on Mailbox 9. She dipped her pen, paused, and began to write, not knowing if the letter would reach him or if he would ever return. But she wrote anyway, because some promises live not in answers, but in the act of writing them down. The house on Willow Street had been empty for almost a year before David Parker finally decided to clear it out. It had belonged to his great-aunt Eleanor, who had lived there until her final days. She had never married, had no children, and left behind more objects than memories. The autumn wind crept through the cracked windows, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly sweet, like dried ink on forgotten paper. David wasn't looking for anything in particular. He moved through the rooms methodically, packing away dishes, folding linen yellowed by time, and stacking old books in boxes for donation. Each creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder in the empty house, as if it were holding its breath. Upstairs in the attic, he found a small wooden trunk tucked behind a stack of suitcases. Its lid was scratched, but one thing stood out, a faint number carved by hand. 9. He knelt down and brushed away a thin film of dust. The trunk wasn't locked. Inside, neatly arranged and bound with twine, were stacks of letters, hundreds of them. Some were postmarked from Maplewood, others from cities he didn't recognize. All bore the same 2 names, Eleanor Parker and Richard Cole. The air in the attic shifted when he opened the trunk, as if the past had just exhaled. David carried the trunk downstairs and set it on the kitchen table, where the afternoon light poured in through the old lace curtains. He untied the first bundle carefully, afraid the paper might crumble in his hands. The envelopes were yellowed but intact, the ink faded to a soft brown. Each one felt like a heartbeat preserved in paper. He chose one at random. The postmark read December 1960. Inside was a letter from Richard, written in careful looping script. I don't know when I'll return, but every letter from you is a piece of home I carry with me. Promise me you'll keep writing. Promise me you won't let the silence win. David read it twice, then 3 times, feeling something stir inside him, a quiet, aching wonder. As the sun lowered outside, David kept reading. The letters formed a story, piece by piece, like a film unfolding in slow motion. He read about summers spent by the bridge, winter nights by the fire, a lost letter that changed everything, and a train that carried Richard away into the fog. The house, once silent, now pulsed with the voices of 2 people who had loved each other across distance and time. On the last bundle, he found a letter addressed but never sent. It was Eleanor's handwriting, older now, shakier. I don't know if this will ever reach you, but if someone finds these letters one day, I hope they'll understand. This was not a story of endings. It was a story of pages written even when no one was reading. David sat back, the letter trembling in his hands. He looked around the kitchen, at the worn table, the faded curtains, the life that had unfolded quietly within these walls. He realized that these letters weren't meant to be buried forever. They were meant to be found. Eleanor had kept them safe, not out of regret, but out of love. Love that hadn't faded, even as decades slipped by. That evening, David placed the trunk in the back of his car. The air outside was crisp, and the first stars were beginning to appear. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, whether to donate the letters to a local museum, publish them, or simply keep them safe. But he knew one thing for certain. Their story deserved to be told. As he drove away, the house faded into the darkness behind him. In the trunk, beneath the letters, the number 9 was carved deep into the wood, worn but unbroken. Somewhere between the pages, between the words written and never answered, Richard and Eleanor's story waited. Not for closure, but for someone to listen. Some stories aren't lost. They're simply waiting. Waiting in attics, in boxes carved with numbers, in letters written by hands that no longer exist. Richard and Eleanor's story never demanded an ending. It lived in ink, in promises whispered between pages, and in the quiet persistence of Mailbox 9 standing through every season. When David opened that trunk, he didn't just uncover old letters. He unlocked an entire world suspended in time. Every folded page carried laughter, longing, silence, and hope. It was a reminder that love doesn't always follow the neat lines of a storybook. Sometimes it lingers in the margins, unfinished but unforgettable. As we close this chapter, the question remains: what happened after the final letter was written? Perhaps the answer lies not in finding an ending, but in recognizing that some loves are meant to echo, generation after generation. Somewhere out there, more stories like this wait to be found, tucked away in forgotten places, waiting for someone to listen.